I know you're wanting to listen to this episode of the Comics Alternative, but before we get started, let me just remind you guys that it's the gift-giving season. Now, that may be obvious, but one of the things that's not so obvious is that you can get all of your stuff and help out the podcast by going to comicsalternative.com/Amazon. Click through on our Amazon banner that you find on that page, and whatever you get during that visit to Amazon, the Comics Alternative will get a few cents kickback. So, whether it be Hanukkah, Christmas, Kwanzaa, or Festivus, get your gifts through our Amazon Associate link. It's a smart way to get your books, and you'll be helping out the podcast. And isn't that what the holiday season is all about? Helping our podcast. This is the Comics Alternative Interviews, a conversation with Bill Kartalopoulos. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative Interviews. I'm Derek.
And I'm Andy, and we're two guys with PhDs talking about comics.
And we're pleased to have back on the show Bill Kartalopoulos. He is the series editor of the Best American Comics, and we talk with him about this year's offering. But before we get to that conversation, we want to let all of you know that this episode of the Comics Alternative Interviews is brought to you by the great folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. There, you're going to find all DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles at 40% off of the cover price if you pre-order. For all of the other publishers, you'll find that those discounts are 20 to 35% off of the cover price. And every month, you're going to find some unbelievable specials. Sometimes those specials are going to be as much as 45% off the cover price. Sometimes maybe 50% off cover. But many times you can find discounts that are higher than that.
That's right. And this month, as in every month, you can take advantage of a bunch of bundles where you can get multiple comics from the same publisher at a deeper discount than you would get if you bought those issues individually. And this month they have bundles from DC, Marvel, and Valiant, among other selections. So check that out.
That's right. That's dcbservice.com. You gotta go there for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. And after you do get your titles there, please be sure to send them an email and tell them that the two guys with PhDs sent you.
That's right.
Andy, it was fun having Bill back on the show. We had him on the Comics Alternative exactly 2 years ago, in fact. It was his first outing as series editor with the Best American Comics. And that year, it was the Scott McCloud volume that we were discussing. We wanted to have him on last year, but the timing was just off. We couldn't arrange a time to do the interview with him that worked with his schedule and our schedule. That allowed us to put out the interview before the end of the year. So I'm sorry we missed him last year, but it's great to have him back for 2016.
Yeah, it was great to have him on.
Yeah. So let's go ahead and let our listeners hear what we discussed.
Yep, let's go. So we'd like to welcome back to the show Bill Kartalopoulos, who is the editor of the Best American Comics series, and here to talk about the 2016 edition. Thanks for joining us, Bill.
Oh, thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, welcome back to the podcast.
I really appreciate your continued annual attention to the series. It's something that I'm really happy about.
Well, and we'll have a little mutual admiration society here. I'm really grateful for this volume every year because it kind of lets me know what I missed from the previous years in some cases, and in other cases it kind of reinforces my taste. So those are both good things. But since it's been a couple of years since you've been on the show, Bill, and there may be some listeners who haven't listened to those earlier episodes, and if they haven't, they should. Can you kind of catch up those listeners on what the process is that goes into putting together one of these volumes?
Sure. The Best American Comics is one of several annual Best American titles published by Houghton, Mifflin, Harcourt. Probably the best known one is Best American Short Stories, which has been coming out, I think, since 1915. And since then, they've expanded and added a bunch of other titles gradually over the years, including things like Best American Essays, Best American Travel Writing, etc. The first Best American Comics came out in 2006. So this year is the 10th anniversary of the series. It's technically the 11th volume in the series, but the 10-year anniversary of the series. So, in a way, if you want to look at it historically, the initiation of the series has something to do with the rise of the graphic novel as a category in the early 2000s, that period of time when we started to see a real influx of book format comics into libraries and bookstores, with the graphic novel established as a real category of publishing. So Best American Comics is part of that in a way. It's part of the embrace of comics in book form by the publishing world and the literary world that happened in the early 2000s. And the way that these Best American titles typically work is that there's a series editor who works on multiple volumes from year to year, collaborating each year with a special guest editor. So I've been the series editor for Best American Comics since the 2014 volume. That was the first one that was published that I worked on. And basically, in short, the way the process works is that we have an open submission policy, as do all of these titles. Anyone can send in their work for consideration for Best American Comics. So I certainly receive many hundreds of comics over the course of the year, ranging from graphic novels from large publishing houses to handmade, photocopied and stapled zines. People who do work for online publication email me and send me links or PDFs, and pretty much anything in between that you can imagine. So we get a lot of submissions. In addition, it's part of my job to essentially keep my antenna up and spend time going to comic book stores and bookstores and comics festivals and talking to trusted colleagues and looking around online and so on, to make sure, from my point of view, that we're getting the material that as much as possible, that we're getting the material that we should be looking at. Anything that seems like it should be interesting, that it seems like it might be interesting, I try to get my hands on, and encourage people to send their work in, whether I'm talking to a publisher or an individual artist. So anyway, through these various activities, I end up with a very large pool of submissions for consideration. I go through all that material and I make a kind of pre-selection of approximately 120 or so pieces that I then send to our guest editor, who I work with each year, and that's a different person every year. For the 2014 edition, I worked with Scott McCloud. For the 2015 edition, I worked with Jonathan Leatham. And for the current 2016 edition, I worked with Roz Chast. And as I said, most of the Best American titles work this way, where there's a special guest editor who comes in every year. So what that does, I think, is it keeps the book fresh from volume to volume. And it, I think in a way, it sort of acknowledges that any kind of best of the year project has an element of subjectivity to it. And I think what that does is it makes a strength out of that subjectivity by bringing in a new subjectivity every year, so that it becomes interesting, I think, from year to year to see what each person's take on contemporary comics might be. But at the same time, by my presence and activity and so on, I'm also, keeping a sort of consistent eye on the field and sort of balancing that out with a little bit of consistency. So it's an interesting and probably fairly unique type of editorial collaboration where I pool together about 120 or more pre-selections. I send them to the guest editor, and then the guest editor assembles the final contents of the book. And then from that point forward, I have a lot less interesting logistical work to do to get in touch with artists and get permissions and get files. And I also get to work with the guest editor and with Houghton, Mifflin, Harcourt to select artists to commission to produce covers and end papers for the book. The guest editor and myself also write an introduction and a foreword, respectively. And, there are other bits and pieces of work, some more logistical than others, involved in the process.
Okay. I'm glad you ended that with mentioning the foreword and introduction, because that's actually where I kind of wanted to go before digging into the contents of this book, because your own foreword drops a kind of gauntlet right away in the first sentence with "there is no mainstream in comics," and then goes into an interesting history of comics that kind of leads us to today and to the question of why we don't have a mainstream. And so, could you kind of clarify, I guess, that idea that why isn't there a mainstream in comics today, or if there is, it's things like the Rage comics that you mentioned there.
Yeah, I suppose. I think part of it is because it's hard to think of comics really as a unified field, and there are, putting this in kind of quotation marks, I think there are a lot of partisans for different areas of comics, depending on one's particular area of interest or maybe the particular subfield of comics that one functions within, either whether it's strictly as a reader and a consumer, or as a critic, or as a participant, or on some level a creative participant, or maybe a participant in the infrastructure around that particular area around comics, and so on. I think that I, in part, was responding to the fact that I have, occasionally seen responses to Best American Comics from people whose primary experience of comics is going to comic book stores, who say that the book is not principally engaged with what they call, quote unquote, mainstream comics. And that, to me, has always been a really puzzling way of describing that material, although I do understand historically how that terminology came to be fixed in place within the context of that, sort of subcultural industry and that subcultural community. So I felt like, one of the things that I could do was attempt to explore sort of the history of comics, how that terminology came to be set in stone for a certain readership, and critique that a little bit.
Yeah, I when I was reading it, I was really fascinated with it, because I'm also preparing a comics class that I'm going to teach in the spring, and I think about my students looking in on comics from the outside. That part kind of, it seems like part of the phenomenon you're describing is how people, whether they're fans or creators or critics or whatever, from the inside look at comics and kind of factionalize themselves or whatever. Whereas when I think about my students coming in to it and they find out that I'm teaching a class on comics, they'll say universally, "I love comics," which is weird to me, because I don't, if that many of my students are saying that, then that means that comics are way more popular than they appear to actually be. But then, what they say when they say they love comics is that they love, the Marvel movies. They're now it's not even just that they're associating comics with a comic book with with the reading experience, but comics has taken on this other meaning for them, which means basically superhero movies, not even superhero comics.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a strange thing because in a way, especially if you look back at the last, 20 or so years of history, it's almost like a kind of cycle, in my mind, a not very progressive cycle has been completed, because I feel like, in like the late 90s when people were advocating for the potential of comics before they entered into the mainstream of book publishing, through the, publication of things like, Chris Ware's work and Daniel Klaus's work by imprints of Random House and so forth. There was a kind of militant argument that comics are not a genre. It's an art form. It's not a genre. This is something certainly Scott McCloud used to say over and over again. It's not a genre. It's not a genre. I mean, a big part of the argument of understanding comics is that comics is an abstract form. It's a medium. It's a neutral medium like anything else, and it shouldn't be mistaken for a genre with which it's typically identified, or maybe a group of genres with which it's typically identified. And now, because of the cultural dominance of the superhero movies, the Marvel movies, the DC movies, the television programs, and all of the kind of associated merchandising and licensing that saturates the culture, it's almost cycled back to that point, and it becomes suddenly important again to make that case, and again, that feels a little, unfortunately, regressive to me, although again, like with many of these things, from a historical point of view, you can understand how that happened.
I wonder too if there's going to be another, a couple years from now, I'm gonna start seeing these students who grew up with like Raina Telgemeier, or to connect to the book you have, something like C.C. Bell's El Deafo, that they grew up with that as being kind of ubiquitous in their lives.
Yeah,
and then we get a whole new kind of understanding, I guess, of comics as being a normal part of their lives, and then do we get a new mainstream?
That's interesting, because I think we're already seeing something like that, and it's almost through like the double punch of manga and then web comics, because when I talk to my students, and they tell me the same thing as yours, Andy, and they're like, oh yeah, we're really into comics. What they mean by that partly is the comics properties, right? Especially through the Marvel movies, to a lesser degree the DC stuff and cinema, and also on TV. But they also refer to comics in terms of what they see online, primarily through web comics. And many of, at least style-wise, in terms of the art, the web comics that we see now are heavily informed by the popularity of manga over the past 15 years, and manga really dominating the book sections or the comic sections of Barnes & Noble, Borders when we had that, and the like. So I think that when our students think of comics, I think those are the two things that really come to mind. The big two universes as they find themselves in TV and film, and then manga, and then the ubiquitous comic found online. In other words, they're not going to come and they're not the kind who would normally visit or go out of their way to visit the local comic shop and pick up their dose of comics that way.
Yeah, it's very all over the place. And I also teach students. I teach a graphic novel course at Parsons. And, typically on the first day, I kind of go around the room and ask the students if they have a favorite comic or comics that they like to read. And it really is, as you suggest, kind of all over the map. Sometimes there are a few who, are in the habit of going to the comic book store and reading that material. And there are some students who, their main exposure to comics has been reading some of the major crossover graphic novels, like Fun Home and Mouse and Persepolis and so on, either because they just read them out of interest or perhaps they've been assigned those books in some previous class because those books have entered into a lot of course syllabi and curricula. Or, in some cases, as you say, manga, in other cases, web comics. So it really is all over the place, and everyone kind of comes to the table with a, somewhat different perspective on what they think of when they think of comics. And then there are some students who really haven't read much at all, but they just take the class because it sounds interesting. If they think it sounds easy, they're usually disabused of that quickly. Yeah. It's an interesting moment anyway, and that was part of what I wanted to get to in that foreword that I wrote, was that there isn't any one area of comics that can really claim a kind of mainstream status. But, if you had to peg something as mainstream, it would probably be either something like, the Rage comics, which really are part of our mass culture, or maybe, you would want to look at something like Raina Telgemeier's books, which, at this point have been, on the bestseller list, every week for years at a time. They sell in, massive numbers to, middle grade readers, and they're sold by Scholastic, the largest publisher of children's books in the country. They're sold not just at bookstores, but at book fairs and so on and so forth. And at the end of the day, what I ultimately wanted to say at the end, though, was that, these are useful things to keep in mind. But if you're engaged in a critical project like Best American Comics, then to an extent, those things have to become irrelevant, because then you're really just looking at the work from a critical point of view.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about this year's volume, edited by Roz Chast. And, you pointed out early on that one of the beauties of the Best American Comics series is that every year there is another guest editor. And so that means that every year a different subjectivity, a different series of experiences and aesthetic privileging comes into play to make every volume quite fresh. But I think on top of that, you guys overall, in terms of the series, have done a real good job in bringing in not just a variety of different people, but people from different perspectives. And it strikes me that this year, with Roz Chast, we get someone, or we get a creator who's unlike anyone we've seen before as an editor since the run began in 2006. Here's someone that I guess up until a few years ago we would primarily think of as a cartoonist, maybe even a gag cartoonist, and not someone who does most of her work in terms of sequential comics narrative. But with the publication a couple of years ago of, can we please talk about something more pleasant? At least I see Chast in a very different light. But she brings a different perspective. I don't know if we want to call it the New Yorker perspective to this. And that's one of the things I found really interesting about this year's volume, is what she has brought. So my question to you, Bill, is in bringing her on board, how has this year's volume, the experience of pulling it together, been different from the previous 2 years?
It's interesting. I kind of, I've talked about this a little bit previously. I feel like I got really lucky in the sense that the first three guest editors I work with really span a spectrum of experience that a guest editor might potentially bring to the volume in terms of a kind of insider versus outsider status. So that, like, for the first volume, I worked with Scott McCloud, who is very much in and of the comics field and a very influential presence within that. There's no question, certainly, that he saw a lot of things through our process that he hadn't seen before, because I see so many things through our submission process, and there are certain things from very small press or self-published areas that hadn't landed on Scott McCloud's radar previously. But in general, he came into the project as you would expect, with an incredible amount of knowledge about comics and, history of comics and contemporary comics and so on. He didn't, need me to educate him at all about the comics field, even though I was, maybe passing along some examples that he hadn't seen before. And the following year, I worked with Jonathan Lethem, who's a novelist who is a real aficionado of comics, knows quite a bit about them, has, incorporated, themes from comics in his fiction, has, written even for Marvel Comics, but also just as a reader and an engaged person in the culture is aware of comics. So he had enough credibility to serve in that role, but at the same time had a kind of nice outsider's point of view, I think, where he didn't really come into it with much baggage in terms of thinking about, so-and-so is really popular, or this work is, very influential or whatever. I mean, he really had a kind of, relatively blank slate approach to the material so that he could really judge it from a critical point of view and take it at face value without as much baggage around, considerations of who this person is or what their position in the field is or anything like that. Roz is kind of, in a way, sort of in between. She's kind of an insider and an outsider in the sense that, she's a professional cartoonist. She has been since she was in her 20s. She's produced a huge volume of material, a lot of books, but she's been working often within this very, very particular field within the field of being a kind of identified predominantly as a cartoonist doing work for the New Yorker magazine, which has its own tradition, its own history, its own format, its own style, its own tone, etc. And she brings her voice to that publication. But as you pointed out, a couple of years ago, she did produce, excuse me, a graphic novel, essentially, or graphic memoir, visual memoir, whatever you want to call it, called, Can We Please Talk About Something More Pleasant, which is a memoir about her parents at the end of their lives. And in a way, this sort of brought her into the graphic novel community. We even included an excerpt from that work in the 2015 edition of Best American Comics. But a couple of other qualifiers I'd note, though. One is that even though Roz is identified so strongly with the New Yorker, even within that body of work, her work kind of spans formats. It's not all, the typical New Yorker single panel gray wash cartoon with typesetting underneath. I mean, she's done a lot of different kinds of things, even for that magazine. She's done visual essays. She's done pages and sometimes multi-page features that really you would only call comics. I mean, they're sequential text-image combinations. So she breaks out of that format quite a bit. She's done books even outside of the context of the New Yorker. And, as she mentions in her introduction, her influences are really from across the spectrum of cartooning. I mean, she grew up reading Charles Addams, another classic New Yorker cartoonist, but she was also reading, Zap and National Lampoon and things like that. She did come into the job with some awareness of comics, too. I mean, certainly she knew all of the obvious kind of crossover landmark artists, people like Marjane Satrapi and Art Spiegelman and Alison Bechdel and Charles Burns and, those people who kind of anyone who has a kind of glancing awareness of graphic novels would know about. But she even came into it with some awareness of some younger artists whose work she was already aware of and enthusiastic about, people like Gabrielle Bell and Julia Wirtz, for example, who were both in the volume, were artists who she was already aware of and enthusiastic about. So anyway, as a cartoonist working sort of outside of the constructed field of comics, she brought, like I say, kind of a mix of an insider and outsider perspective. So that was interesting. And I thought she did a fantastic job and showed a lot of open-mindedness. I mean, there's a real huge variety of work on display in this volume, I think.
One of the things I'm always interested in seeing when I get one of these volumes is not just what's in it, but how the material is organized. And it does seem like in previous years, with the previous two examples, there was a kind of clear overt organization, and this year there aren't like clearly divided sections or anything like that. And there's also the and I think this is new to this volume, I may be wrong, the introduction to the work that's a biography of the creator and then the statement by the creator. Could you talk about that decision? Sorry.
Oh, no. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. I didn't realize you weren't done talking. I apologize. But yeah, it's interesting. I mean, in a way, this seems like somewhat of a break of format, but that's in a way happenstance in that, working with Scott McCloud on the 2014 edition, he had an idea for organizing the book that was kind of an innovation. Usually, the volumes, if you look at past editions going back to 2006, have been a bit closer to this in that they haven't had specific chapters or categories or subgroupings. Scott had the idea of organizing the book, because as you know from reading Understanding Comics, he's a very analytical thinker. And so his approach to the volume was to treat it as a kind of guided tour through the field of contemporary comics. So he divided the book up into chapters, sort of thematically or topically organized, and wrote mini introductions for each section. Jonathan had admired the way Scott McCloud's organization of the book sort of broke up and organized the reading experience of the volume. So he also, in his way, engaged that challenge of devising thematic categories to group the work into and briefly introducing them within the context of the volume. When it came down to assembling Roz's choices, we did talk a little bit about the different kinds of possibilities that were available to her, but she wasn't interested in grouping works together in any particular way. Rather, she just wanted the pieces to be sequenced in such a way that they would have a nice flow and make a good reading experience, one following after the other. In terms of having the intro page with the bios and so forth, in some ways it's kind of an evolution of Françoise Mouly's volume, which I didn't work on, but she guest edited the Best American Comics 2012. Typically, the volumes have had bios and statements from the participating artists in the back of the book. And Françoise had done something where she asked, instead of asking the artists to write bios, she kind of sent them a list of like 5 questions and something like that, 4 or 5, 6 questions. And they answered the questions briefly, and she included the answers along with, I believe, the cover of the book and a self-portrait on a page right before the piece. And this was kind of taking that idea of having an intro page before the piece, but instead of coming up with some survey, just taking the material that we would normally put in the back of the book and putting it before each story. So I thought it served the function of breaking the book up a little bit, providing a little context for the pieces. And frankly, I think it also makes it a little bit more likely that a reader might actually read through the bios and statements by putting them next to the pieces. I think when they're in the back of the book, it becomes a little easier to skip past it. So, maybe there's a slightly better chance doing it that way, that a reader will become interested to follow up on a piece that they like and, seek out more work by the author or something. It's hard to know. I don't always know fully how these things are received. But anyway, it seemed like a kind of nice alternative to some of the other ways that the book has been organized in the past. In my view, I think that every guest editor should retain the freedom to kind of take a new angle on it. But I really liked the way that this contextualized the pieces and sort of brought the material from the back of the book and sort of peppered it throughout the volume. And I think that in the absence of some other idea, I think this actually might be a good default for the book going forward. But that's going to be up to future guest editors.
Yeah, I really did enjoy this arrangement that you're describing, the fact that with right before each selection we get the more objective biography, and then we get the personal statement from the creator that's being featured, especially when the creator gives something unique, something that the other artists may not do. And I'm thinking of Linda Berry's statement, which is, I guess an illustration to a large degree. And then we get minimalist statements from Adrian Tomine, where he says basically this story was originally published in issue 14 of Optic Nerve, published by Drawn and Quarterly. And then my favorite, Joe Sacco's terse, this excerpt is from my book Bump. Bump is about our 21st century world. I don't think we're going to make it.
Yeah, I mean, we give the contributors total latitude as to how they respond to the request for a bio and statement. And as you say, I mean, some people really write something very interesting and unique, and others just kind of give the basic data. And as you mentioned, Linda hand wrote her statement and scanned it in and sent it to us, and it just felt like it would be kind of a lost opportunity if we didn't just show the image. It required, some layout choices. But yeah, I was happy to have that. And it just blended seamlessly in with her piece too, which is also written on similar lined note, or drawn and written on similar lined notebook paper. So it was kind of a piece with that work.
You said earlier, when you were describing the process, that basically with each year's volume, you will collect a variety of comics and then pare them down and send on those recommendations to the guest editor, and then the guest editor will cull through those, maybe bring in additional comics that she or he maybe wanted to include that you didn't. And I'm wondering, with this year's volume, what was roughly the dynamic between you and Chast in terms of her taking on what you had forwarded to her, or even her bringing in comics that you hadn't initially recommended that she consider?
Well, in this case, I think because Roz isn't as immersed in the comics field on a day-to-day basis, she was perhaps a little bit more reliant on me to show things to her in such a way where she wasn't, accumulating large piles of stuff on her own. But at the same time, typically what I like to do when I start working with one of these individuals who I work with as guest editors on the volume is I like to talk to them a little bit up front and get a sense of if there's anything they're looking for, a type of work they might be interested in, or even a specific artist who they might want me to, see if that person had work that was eligible in the year that they're working on the volume. So with Roz, as with every guest editor, up front, she told me a little bit about her tastes and mentioned a few artists whose work she was interested in, said, if you see something by, so-and-so, give it to me so I can consider it, and so on. So that's very typical, and that happens every year. And, I think to an extent it's helpful for the guest editor for me to do that and kind of get them the material that they're interested in. So it's been a little different every year working with different people, and the extent to which they maybe pull in some things on their own maybe just has a little more to do with the extent to which that person has a real day-to-day exposure to comics on various levels. I do know that they all, at bare minimum, do their own due diligence so that they don't have to feel too, slavishly reliant on my tastes. I know that, every guest editor is kind of just sort of, queried trusted friends and colleagues and maybe poked around at the bookstore, at the comic book store or whatever, just to, feel like they're confident that, I'm sending them the material that they might want to see that's eligible. But in this case, it was a pretty straightforward case of my putting together a lot of material for Roz and sending it over to her, and then her spending time with it and making selections.
In past years, last time we talked with you about this, and then last year when Derek and I were discussing it, one of the things that often comes up is works that get chosen for the collection that may have challenges in terms of format. Mm-hmm. that don't fit uniform into the kind of uniform arrangement of this. I know for example, last year there was Joe Sacco's Great War. That was an example of that. Was there anything this year that any of the works that are in here this year that you kind of struggled with or had to make certain choices with the way they're formatted?
That's a good question. I don't think we had any pieces that were especially challenging in that way this year. I'm just flipping through the book a little bit myself to remind myself, just in case there's something that I'm forgetting. I mean, there were some things that needed to be reformatted a little bit, but I think we just got a little bit lucky in that the solutions were fairly straightforward. I'm thinking, for example, of Liana Fink's piece, All the Paintings Here Agree, which originally ran on a website, and each page has 4 square panels, but the way it originally ran online was essentially as one long scroll with each image below the other. But because the panels are square and uniform in size and shape, it was kind of a no-brainer to just, sort of lay them out as a 4-panel grid on each page, and that worked out, I think, well. I remember when we were talking to Chris Ware about his excerpt from the last Saturday, these pages were sort of presented as unified spreads originally online, and he kind of raised the question of whether it would be better to sort of run them sideways as spreads or break it up across 2 pages. But we ultimately agreed that the work would be much more legible, broken up across 2 pages and run in a normal portrait orientation. But I think those were the main ones that stick out in my mind as having some format questions. There are probably a few little ones here and there, but in this case, nothing that really required heavy-duty problem solving.
One of the ones I was curious about was Casanova Frankenstein's entry, because I like this a lot about it, that you can see the binding in the middle of each panel. So I haven't seen the Adventures of Tad Martin. So is this a smaller book, or were you reducing the pages down for this?
That's actually the way we've run the material is pretty close to the way that it was published. I mean, the scale might be nudged one way or the other a little bit. But yeah, it's interesting when you look at that. You can see it's got a kind of materiality to it.
Yeah.
Each pair of 2 panels seems to be kind of a spread from a kind of Moleskine-like sketchbook. So yeah, as you said, you can see in some pairs of panels, like the stitching down the middle that separates the 2 images. And then each page is essentially like 2 subsequent spreads from the sketchbook that are then stacked up on top of each other. But that's the way that ran in the comic book.
Yeah.
So if you look on the intro page, I mean, you can see we run the cover of the comic book, and it's a vertically oriented thing. So when you see those 4 panels together, that were originally 2 spreads in a sketchbook, perhaps. That's the way it was published in the comic book, and the comic was published in a kind of sort of off-white newsprint. So we ran it with a very slight gray tone behind it to mimic the publication of the original work.
Now, you mentioned as an example of online comics both Fink and Ware's contribution. Now, I haven't gone back to compare the number of webcomics in this year's volume to the number of webcomics that have appeared in, let's say, the last 2 or 3 years' volumes. But it just struck me that this year there's much more of a webcomics presence in Best American Comics. And I'm wondering, in all the contributions that you were sent, along with the comics for this particular volume that you sought out and discovered on your own, where was there a significantly larger percentage of contributions that you sent on to Chaz that were web-based?
I don't remember how that would have sort of broken down in terms of proportion in the process, in terms of whether I saw more webcomics this year or if I sent along more webcomics this year. I didn't necessarily get the impression that I was looking at a ton more webcomics maybe than I have in past years, but just for whatever reason, maybe it just happened to be the case that a few more comics that originated online happened to make it into the final book. I do feel like online is the online sphere for comics publication is sort of always maturing or changing in interesting ways. I think it's changed a lot over the last few years. I think it used to be that when one would talk about online comics, one would be thinking maybe very specifically of a kind of self-defined sphere of web comics that maybe tended to obey certain formats, the kind of typical, once a week or twice weekly or 3 times weekly online comic strip that maybe was a gag or maybe was a continuing storyline. And it seemed that there was a kind of model that held for a few years of, this very typical framework around the material of, these buttons you see of first, last, previous, next, whatever, this kind of almost default set of this kind of default framework around the material, and also kind of a default way maybe of approaching the format of the work in the sense that, for a long time, I think webcomics were sort of mimicking, except for some experimental work, they were sort of mimicking the format of newspaper comic strips in a way, and a kind of set formula about how to structure a website around web comics in the sense of here's the daily comic and here's the space, here's my little author's note, whatever that is, whether it's a commentary on the material or just a diary-like entry followed by comments from the users and a sort of culture around the webcomic, and maybe a kind of attempt to support or partially support oneself by selling book collections or mugs or stickers or whatever to the community that one had built around the webcomic. Now I think it's really spiked off in a lot of different directions. I think there is still a very permeable membrane between print and online. I think a lot of people are posting comics online that they expect to eventually maybe collect in a printed edition or republish in a printed edition, maybe with an idea of, hopefully attracting a publisher to produce a collected edition of the work, and the formats can sort of be all over the place. But in a way, I do think it's sort of trending back towards a kind of comic book format. Tumblr certainly supports that. There are a lot of I feel like that over the last couple of years, there have been a lot more online magazines that have started commissioning artists to produce comics for the online magazine.
Right.
I don't remember if even Julia Wertz's piece, for example, was produced for the New Yorker's website. That was a digital exclusive kind of thing that ran on the New Yorker's website. And certainly there are a lot of other online magazines that I've seen over the last few years that have been running original web-only comics pieces on the sites. So that's one area. And again, there's Tumblr. There's Chris Ware's piece actually ran on the Guardian's website, as we were saying before. And he's not someone who I would identify as being a web cartoonist, but it happens to be the case that the Guardian commissioned him to run a serial on their website, and that's exclusive, as far as I know, to the website. Maybe it's been in the print edition too. I don't remember. Even the piece by Gigi, the last one in the book, "Don't Leave Me Alone," that's something that I have seen both as a comic online. She posts all of her comics online. She also prints print editions of the work. So this also was published as a 3-color, risograph, staple-bound comic book that she published herself. So you can find these things sometimes in different ways. So I think in some ways posting stories like that online for some artists has become equivalent to either a replacement for or a supplement to the more traditional older way of self-publishing a mini comic and taking it around to comic book conventions. I think it allows the work to circulate. It allows people to get feedback from their peers. It allows the artist to maybe build a little visibility around their work, both in terms of gaining a readership and maybe gaining the notice of an editor or a publisher or something like that. So yeah, I think it's just a constant moving target. So it's very hard for me to generalize about comics online. But it is interesting. It is interesting to try to even attempt and fail to keep up with that.
Yeah. There's just so much out there. And although on the one hand, I very much hesitate to say that there's such thing as a kind of a typical webcomic format. If you look at enough of them, there does seem to be kind of a fairly popular way of presenting your work as a webcomic. Although the online comics that you reproduce in this year's volume of Best American Comics just strike me as the kind of online comics that are, let's say, nominated every year for an Ignatz Award under their online or webcomic category, right? Because those always seem to me to be atypical of what I hesitate to call kind of a typical webcomic layout and presentation. So that there is something a little maybe off, experimental, or not usual in the online offerings I see in this year's volume.
Perhaps, I don't know. I mean, I wouldn't. I don't know what the baseline theoretical generic webcomic is, so I can't necessarily say for sure. I mean, I think I was pleased that Roz included, for example, a 2-pager by Taylor Ruth Baldwin, and she's someone who's not maybe part of a recognizable webcomics community, but her piece has been hugely widely read online. Her Tumblr is in fact quite popular, and her comics and other pieces that include writing and photography and whatever attract a lot of comments and likes and reblogs and responses of various kinds. So in a way, I think she, if there is to go back to what we were saying with the introduction, that kind of mainstream of the Tumblr world, she's kind of in that. But it's not necessarily something that is considered part of what you might construct as a web comics field per se.
Mm-hmm. I'm glad you brought up that particular piece. Taylor Ruth Baldwin, because that gets to another idea, another thing that I look for when I look at these volumes is looking for the thing that I'd never heard of that blows me away or makes me want to look at more stuff by that particular creator. So and part of this is maybe my own lack of exposure to certain things, but a couple of years ago it was Sam Alden, and last year I think it was Gina Winbrandt, and then this year I think the one that really stood out to me in that way was Lance Ward's Adults Only. Yeah. Which not only in terms of the story, but in terms of the statement that he makes about his approach, that this is a kind of spontaneous work that he creates. And you had to devote a lot of the book to that. I mean, that's 40 pages?
It's less than 40. I don't remember the exact page count. We typically try and keep excerpts under 30 pages just so that they don't completely dominate the volume, and that we have enough room for variety within the book. But I think
it's a little over 20.
Like 25 pages or something like that. Yeah, his work is great. It's very it's very under the radar because he just self-publishes this stuff, and this is actually not the first self-published book by Lance that I'd received as a submission. I think maybe in the 2014 volume I had listed the another book, self-published book by him called Kmart Shoes in the notable list at the back of the volume. Yeah, and his work is tremendous. I mean, it's really hard to describe. I mean, on the surface it has a sort of kind of casual marker drawn kind of look to it, but it's a very effective and highly consistent visual approach. And then when you start reading it, it's just very searing, self-searching, personal narrative, kind of memoir with a kind of nested time frame often, where he's recalling himself telling his psychiatrist about something else that happened to him or something. I mean, it's very straightforward to read it, but actually when you pause, there's a kind of complex structure. Sometimes it goes into some pretty dark places, but there's also sort of a lightness to it and a kind of self-deprecating humor about it, even when he's talking about failed suicide attempts. I mean, which is not something that you would associate with a kind of humorous story necessarily. But yeah, his work is great, and you can find a bunch of it online. Again, I think that's one of the nice things about including all of that author information up front, is that if you're interested in it, the info is right there. You can go to his website and see more. And as I said, he's produced several self-published books, and I think his work is really great. And it's not explicitly the function of Best American Comics to expose underexposed artists. It's to just be, to the best of our ability, put together a strong critical statement. But by default, that ends up cutting across, the field, so that we have people who are super well known, like Adrian Tomine and Chris Ware, alongside people whose work hasn't been that widely exposed, like Lance Ward or Taylor. Well, Taylor has been exposed online, Taylor Ruth Baldwin, but I just mean in print. Maybe to an audience that's seen it before. So that's one of the nice side effects of the book, I think, and I think it is very important to the artists, and they're glad for that aspect of being in the book, beyond the kind of just the sort of honorific inclusion, and so on.
Well, it's a great side effect. I'm with what you guys have said. One of my favorites of this collection is Taylor Ruth Baldwin's. She's someone whose work I'd never seen before, so that was a great introduction. And then the piece that comes right before hers, Char S. May and Lauren Poor's contributions, I had not seen their work. And the thing about Lance Ward, I love this short piece, this excerpt, But it seems that this is something, when I was reading this, I thought, I should know this guy, but I don't. And I had the experience as I was reading this of something completely new, but at the same time feeling that it was familiar, or at least I feel like I should have been familiar with this. And I don't know if, not having read other work from Ward, if that's a typical experience the reader may have with his work, or if that's just where I was coming from when I read this.
Well, he certainly has a very strong voice. I mean, when you read the just from a writerly point of view, and the work is kind of narrated. And I mean, it almost feels like he's sitting down telling you a story, like
right. And the sophistication of the narrating process, which you pointed out, right? You have story, a narrator, him as a narrator, but at different periods of his life and drawn in different ways that represent different stages of where he's telling whatever he's telling us. Yeah. And it's I'm really glad that people who hadn't seen that work have had a chance to see it in Best American Comics. And I think, again, that goes back to the fact that, it doesn't matter if the work is from a big publisher or self-published, if it's well-known or obscure. In this case, this was a work that was self-published, and I think, not a lot of people have had a chance to see, certainly not enough people. And as you pointed out, it's not exactly the longest piece in the book, but I think it's probably one of the 3 longest ones. And Roz loved the work, felt really strongly about it, and was I thought made a really strong statement about the work by including such a large excerpt. Now, in terms of excerpting works or finding pieces within larger collections, I'm curious about the challenge of that, because, there's some contributors like, the aforementioned Casanova Frankenstein, where we get a part of the Adventures of Tad Martin book, or Joe Ullman, right? That came from his collection. But when you get to something like here, where do you decide to begin and end? Richard McGuire's here. And there are other examples of this in this year's volume. It just strikes me that if I were an editor, both the general series editor or someone like, let's say, Roz Chast as a guest editor, that would be one of the biggest challenges for me. Where do I start and where do I stop? And whose decision is that?
That's always a kind of tough part of the process. Usually what happens is as we get close to the point of having final choices, the guest editor has a kind of, medium, somewhere between a short and a long list. I'll call it a medium list of the things that they think they want to include. I help them as much as they want me to help them at that point to get it down to the page count that we can accommodate. In some cases, as one works towards that page count, it's very straightforward. The Joe Ullman piece that you mentioned, for example, is a self-contained short story that appeared in a collection of self-contained short stories. Mm-hmm. So that has a fixed number of pages. It doesn't make sense to excerpt whatever it is, a 15 or 20 page short story. It should, be included in whole, or, if it's to be included. And so some of those things kind of get pinned down and help form the structure of the book and give us some information ultimately about how much page length we have left to work with. And then it gets a little tricky, and sometimes the guest editor has to make some tough choices as we see how many pages we have left and how much room there is to work with. So, in some cases, in terms of thinking about a book in terms of excerpts, in some cases the guest editors maybe had a book on hand that they wanted to include, and then, as the process develops, they start to realize that, this book, just in terms of pure narrative terms, is very, very hard to excerpt intelligibly. And that might be a reason for not including something in the end, for even if the guest editor liked it very much, because there is also a consciousness that, we're not just making a best of list for the year. We're putting together a book that should function as a reading experience. And if you are going to present work in excerpted form, it should be represented well. so that the reader, really has, at least in a kind of sample form, a chance to access the work and to recognize for themselves what it is that the guest editor found valuable about that work. But anyway, so there's some tough choices. Some pieces lend themselves more to short excerpts than others. With the Richard McGuire book, for example, that's one where the book is kind of non-linear and doesn't have a kind of chapter structure, and that can be helpful if a book's broken into chapters. For example, the Casanova Frankenstein piece was broken into 3 chapters, so the idea was to just run the second chapter of the comic book. And for the Richard McGuire pieces, I remember, just to talk about this a little bit more concretely, I remember that Roz really liked that one spread that had all of the insults that were over the years on page 228 and 229 of the Best American Comics. So you have this juxtaposition where on the one hand you have this kind of disturbing future image of water, perhaps from rising sea levels, streaming in through the broken window of the house that we've seen so many times. But then it's kind of overlaid with all of these little tiny panels that each contain a word balloon from across the years, some of them more period specific than others, and people are saying, weirdo, dirtbag, klutz, jerk, kook, dweeb, doofus, nerd, etc. And so anyway, that became a kind of a good thing to pin down, because there is, if you've spent time with Richard McGuire's here, even though it's nonlinear, there are these kind of almost like musical arrangements within the book, little threads that sometimes develop over a few spreads. So that if you go back to the first spread that we included a few pages before, it kind of starts this sequence of kind of conflicts and insults, So the first panel is from 1720 of someone saying, "You, sir, are full of drink and low conversation, without dignity of appearance or manner," and that sort of builds up, and then on the next spread, "Oh, thou dunderhead, you nincompoop, you imbecile," and then it climaxes in the pages that we were just talking about, and then it kind of takes a turn, for a few spreads into other topic areas, and the final spread that we indicated is just a kind of silent 2-page single image of the work of the world at 1 million BCE, with water just covering the surface that we've been seeing in various other aspects over a long span of history. So that seemed like a nice place to pause. Seemed to kind of bring it to a rest to have that single silent image there. So that's one example that I happen to recall pretty well, because it was a little challenging, and I hope that is somewhat illuminating. And I know that for sure for Roz, as she mentions in her introduction, the narrative experience of the reader was really important. She mentions that, she was drawn to works that had strong narratives, but additionally, she also wanted to make sure that if we were going to excerpt something, it would have give the reader enough of a narrative experience to justify it. She wasn't, interested in just putting a little 4-page sequence out of a graphic novel just to kind of tip the hat to it, which, actually is, in some places an approach that Scott McCloud and Jonathan Lethem were a little more open to, and, just kind of giving a reader just a little sample of something just to acknowledge it, even if there wasn't room for a more extensive selection. In Roz's case, she wanted each piece to have its own narrative weight within the book.
You were mentioning, or we were talking about Joe Ullman, and I was looking through this year's volume, and unless I'm missing something, Joe's is the only piece, and his short story is Shut Your Pie Hole, Johnny Pinetop, that was part of a collection of shorter works by the same creator, right? This is from the book Happy Stories About Well-Adjusted People, which is, the perfect title for a book like this. And I remember back in 2014, this was one of my favorite books of the year. And so my question is, when it comes to, let's say, this particular case of Joe Ullman, was it this particular story, Shut Your Pie Hole, Johnny Pinetop, that you forwarded on to Roz, or was it the collection, Happy Stories About Well-Adjusted People, that you forwarded on, and then as a representative piece, you chose Shut Your Pie Hole?
Well, actually, there are a few other pieces I could point to that have a kind of similar status, but there's this other qualification that has to do with time period. So, I could have mentioned this before at the top of the show when I was explaining process, but one of the things about the book is that there is a kind of lag time required in order for us to pull the materials together and do all of those, less exciting logistical tasks that are involved with publishing an anthology of previously published work. But there's a specific time frame that each volume obeys. So the Best American Comics covers new North American comics that were first published between September 2014 and August 2015. So it's basically like from fall to fall, and then the book comes out the following fall, if that makes sense. So it basically takes about a year to get the book together once the reading period closes. So in this case, that book, Happy Stories for Well-Adjusted People, was principally composed, maybe except for this one, entirely composed, I don't remember, of previously published short stories that had appeared in anthologies and various other places.
Oh, okay.
If I recall correctly, I think there were 2 stories that were new to that publication that Joe wrote and drew for inclusion in the book. So as I recall, I had flagged the 2 new pieces and basically told Roz, just FYI, I think you may like this work here, but just so you know, this is mostly previously published material that's not eligible for a volume. However, there are 2 new pieces that you could consider. So in that case, Roz would have read the 2 stories that were new to the volume, and then on her own identified Shut Your Pie Hole, Johnny Pinetop as a piece that she wanted to include in the book. I generally am not too... if there's an artist who I think the guest editor might be interested in, I'm not too insistent that the guest editor consider one work or another if there are multiple options, So, for example, the book, or the story Fashion Cat by Alex Schubert appeared in his book Blobby Boys 2, published by Koyama Press. And Blobby Boys 2 is mainly a book of short stories that all feature the same characters, the Blobby Boys. And in this one, the Fashion Cat was a little different because the Fashion Cat is a side character, and I think in some of the other narratives, but in this one story was the main character. So anyway, in this case, I would have sent the Blobby Boys 2 book to Roz. To be honest with you, I do not like to try and predict too much what the guest editor will or won't like because, you just never know. That's the whole point of bringing someone else in. I had a feeling that the Fashion Cat would maybe be the story. If anything in the book appealed to her, it might be that one because it's very self-contained too. You don't need to know anything about the character going into it, whereas I think the other Blobby Boys pieces gain something from the fact that they're one of many stories featuring these Blobby Boys characters, whereas the Fashion Cat one felt very self-contained to me. Even if you didn't know anything about Alex Schubert and his fictional universe, it felt like almost like a one-shot. But anyway, I would have sent that to her and just said, this is all eligible. Maybe you'll like the Fashion Cat, but your mileage may vary. It's, whatever your pick is. And, in that case, that was the one that she did identify as one that she liked. Same thing with Bump by Joe Sacco, actually. That's a book of somewhat interconnected short pieces. And she, I sent that to her and just said, this is all eligible. I may have indicated one or two that, in my opinion were stronger, but what I will always say when I say that is your opinion may differ and whatever you want to do is fine. So she identified the piece Milk from Bumf, Volume 1, to include in the book. So there are probably some other examples like that I could think of. Well, even the Adrian Tomine piece was in an issue of Optic Nerve that also had another short story called, I think, Intruders, in that issue, as well as maybe a short autobiographical piece.
Right.
So in that case, I would have just sent the issue of Optic Nerve to Roz, and she would have identified Killing and Dying as the piece that she wanted to include in the book. So everything varies on a case-by-case basis.
I agree completely about Fashion Cat. So.
Uh-huh. Well, yeah, it reminds me of like a VH1 Behind the Music type special. I don't know if that's a current reference anymore, but that almost seems like a little subgenre of like the late 90s or something.
Mm-hmm. Well, we know that you're hard at work on the 2017 volume of Best American Comics, and there's a lot that you can't tell us about next year's volume. But I'm going to ask nonetheless, is there anything you can share with us about what we might be expecting from next year's book?
I can't really speak to anything that might have to do with the content of next year's book, which are pretty close to being determined right now. The only thing I can say is, since we were talking a little bit about, the range of guest editors who I worked with before, spanning from, Scott McCloud, who's, such a fixture in the comics world, to Jonathan Lethem, who's, sort of an outside observer of the comics world, perhaps, to Roz, who occupies this unusual position of being sort of a cartoonist, but not, explicitly maybe part of what you would think of as the comics world, although certainly having maybe a foot in it. For the next volume, I'm working with someone who is a highly acclaimed cartoonist who's more strongly identified with the comics world per se than the last couple of guest editors. So it's sort of bringing it back a little bit to the type of career or profile of some of the other previous guest editors who, like Charles Burns or Linda Berry or whomever, these people who are very strongly identified with the world of comics. Or
Neil Gaiman, a very, and I hesitate to use this word, mainstream-linked guest editor.
Yeah, true.
Yeah. Well, Bill, we thank you for taking the time and coming back on the Comics Alternative and talking about this year's Best American Comics, guest edited by Roz Chast, and we hope to have you on next year, and we can talk about your experiences with that mystery guest editor.
Sounds good to me. Thank you so much for having me on the show.
Thanks, Bill.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
That was an interesting interview. We got to kind of see how the sausage is made a little bit with the Best American Comics volumes, but also kind of highlight some of the things that stood out to us as we looked at the volume.
Exactly. And I do appreciate him talking with us again about the process, what goes into making, as you put it, the sausage of Best American Comics. And I was particularly interested in his comments on this year's foreword, which is rather substantial and significant, very different from what we see in the series editor forewords in previous volumes.
Right.
Yep. So that was a great conversation. And if you enjoyed what we were talking about with Bill in terms of this year's Best American Comics, then later this week, you're going to be in for a treat, because Andy and I on our regular review show are going to be discussing the Best American Comics 2016. So be sure to come back for that. And if you want to find great titles like the Best American Comics, then head on over to the website of our sponsor, which is Discount Comic Book Service. If you go to dcbservice.com, you'll find a ton of comics at great prices. You can't beat them for a place to get great costing funny books. And after you do get your books there, get in touch with us and let us know what you're going to be reading. If you go to our website, comicsalternative.com, you'll find that you can send us a voice message via SpeakPipe. Or you can call us the old-fashioned way by picking up the phone and dialing, maybe rotary, 415-3-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427.
That's right, or you can get a hold of us by email. We are 2guys@comicsalternative.com. Or you can get a hold of us individually. I'm Andy at comicsalternative.com.
And I'm Derek at comicsalternative.com.
And you can also check out our Twitter feed at the number 2 guys with PhDs.
That's right. You can also find us on Facebook, Tumblr, Instagram, Google+, Goodreads, Pinterest, and YouTube. You can subscribe to the podcast through iTunes. You can stream us on Stitcher. You can also find us on TuneIn, on Spotify, on iHeartRadio, and on Google Play Music. But you can find every single one of our podcast episodes, as well as the reviews and comics-related commentary that we post on our blog, simply by going to our website, comicsalternative.com.
That's right. That's all the ways to get a hold of us and find out what we're up to.
That's right. Until next episode, I'm Derek.
And I'm Andy. See ya.